So this is going to be a discussion of the DSG software and the shift points. There's a lot that goes into the transmission software, and there's other considerations that you've probably heard, such as the clamping pressure, the speed that it shifts, smoothness, which gets into a more subjective. But one of the things that's pretty clear, and I believe really impacts the driving experience, is the selection of the shift points for the tunes. And in looking at software tunes initially, when I was doing some research on it, I'd hear terms like it races to a higher gear, or it's slow to respond to downshifts, or it gear hunts. And I didn't know what those meant. I had an idea of what they were talking about, but really what was happening, and there are definite distinctions in how different software packages do that, which is what people were trying to capture, but there's programming that's behind that, and you can start to pick out what exactly is happening, and then identify a software tune that is compatible or supports the type of driving that you'd like to do. Speaking of which, I'm going to be talking about this from the perspective of day-to-day driving. If you're going to a track, you're going to the drag strip, you've got autocross, you're trying to optimize shifting for a different set of conditions, which are not those that I'm normally experiencing. Day-to-day driving, where it's going through a neighborhood, merging onto a highway, driving through the grocery store parking lot. So recognizing that the conditions also will dictate what is a better software tune for those particular conditions. So to discuss the shifting, I'll go into a couple of the different situations that are of interest to us. Upshifting, downshifting, this is accelerating downshifting, and then just coasting downshifting. So for the upshift, you've got 0 to 100%, that's driver input, and then whatever engine speed you happen to be at. In this case here, say you're at 25% pedal. When the engine speed gets up to, 1,000 is probably not the best example, probably maybe 2,000 would be better, but once it gets to that engine speed, then it's going to shift up to the next gear. And once you're in second gear, now you've got a similar table that's going to look at going into the following gear after that. What happens with customizing this software is, if this black line represents the stock software, the dashed line might be an aftermarket tune, where that tuner is going to go and raise the engine speed. So now at 10% pedal, instead of shifting up at 800, 1,000, 1,500, whatever RPM, now it's an additional 1,000 RPM later that it's gonna, and they could set that to whatever value they want. So you could have it shift up at 4,000 RPM, which is probably more typical of like a sport tune, but that's an option to do. And likewise, you probably are going to find that the engine speed that's going to upshift at is going to be higher later in the power band with more pedal position. So as you really put more into it and want to accelerate more quickly, it's going to hold off on upshifting, to get you the power that you need. So that's the basic of upshifting. So for downshifting, there's the accelerator pedal range that you're going to input from the driver, and then the engine operating speed. In this case, there's a minimum threshold below which that the car is not going to downshift, and that's indicated by this vertical part of the line. Below, let's just say 20% pedal position, it's not going to downshift. 10 to 15% is probably enough, not enough pedal input to prompt a downshift. But above that threshold, then you're going to get a downshift. Likewise, so it's going to go and check at whatever pedal position you're at. It's going to check what the engine speed is. If you're below the specified value, it is going to downshift to the next lower gear. If you're above that, then it just stays in the gear that you're in. So for instance, if you're at, say, 1500 RPM, and then this is a 1500 RPM line, as soon as you get the pedal above this minimum threshold, 25% say, okay, now it is going to downshift. Once it downshifts into the next lower gear, of course the engine speed is then going to go up, and you're going to have another set of criteria for the engine computer to evaluate, and that's indicated by the dotted line. So if this dark line is 6th gear, you downshift into 5th. Now it's evaluating you were at 30% pedal when you downshifted from 6th. Now you're into 5th. If the engine speed in 5th gear is now above that line when it's downshifted, it'll stay in 5th. If it's below that, it's going to downshift again down into 4th. So that's how you're getting the downshifts. So as far as being slow to downshift, this threshold here is what is being referred to. That if this is pretty far to the right, it means you got to push the pedal down pretty far before it's going to downshift. And this whole line might be much further to the right. So that's what is driving that perception of it's taking more input. I mean, because it literally is. And for stock, on some of these, you can get to the 70-80% pedal is required. But a tuner can adjust that and make it very, very sensitive if they wanted. For the coasting downshift, you've got 6th to 5th, 5th to 4th, 4th to 3rd, etc., down to 2nd to 1st. And then you got the engine speed over here. So as the engine speed comes down, once it hits that designated engine speed, it's going to shift down into the next lower gear from 6th down into 5th. And generally what you see is like 6th to 5th is going to be one of the higher engine speeds when it's going to downshift. You've probably experienced where shifting down from 2nd into 1st, you almost have to stop the car before it's going to downshift. And that's kind of indicated by this really low dot, that you have to be at a really low RPM before the transmission is going to shift down into 1st. These settings are adjustable within the software, so the tuner can adjust those as well. So you could have it so that as soon as you got below 2000 RPM in any gear, it's going to downshift. Of course, the gear you're going into, now, depending on which one it is, the engine, well, anyone, the engine speed's going to go up, but how much it goes up depending on which gear. And that can affect how smooth it feels, depending on how much the engine speed's going to go up, and you're going to get that engine braking effect. So that's something that comes into play there that might be perceived as smoothness, but that's kind of functionally what's going on behind the scenes. So those are the big three situations for shifting. So those are the three situations for shifting, the up, down, and coasting downshift. So just to kind of talk about a couple of situations that get described in more qualitative terms, there's the racing to a higher gear. That is, in this case here, with the upshift, where for a particular pedal position, the shift point is at a fairly low engine speed. So once you shift from 1st gear into 2nd, if this line is relatively low for all of those gears, when it gets into the next gear, which naturally it's going to be at a lower engine speed already, but if this next line for the 2nd to 3rd gear shift is also at a fairly low RPM, it's going to then shift up to the next gear. And depending on the slope of this line, I mean, sometimes that might be desirable at really low pedal inputs, but as you get up into the higher pedal inputs, meaning you're trying to accelerate a little bit faster, if it's quickly shifting into the next gear, I think that's what people are describing when they say it's racing to the higher gear. It's because the criteria to shift up is a much lower engine speed, and so naturally you are more quickly getting to the next gear. So as far as being slow to respond to pedal inputs for downshifting, if this vertical line here, which is the threshold, is over to the right, well, now pedal is, you've got your deeper into the pedal push, and it's not downshifting, and you're at a lower engine speed, so you're not accelerating much, so it's just feeling like it's kind of sluggish. So that's something that most likely is going to be modified by the software that if you're getting into the aftermarket stuff. And then the last one is the coasting. And this kind of ties in with this upshift, and this is with regards to the gear hunting, where it upshifts, but if the threshold for downshifting is close to the upshift value, then you don't have a whole lot of room to operate. The car shifts up, but the threshold for where it's going to downshift once it gets into the next gear may be very close to where it is arriving at. And so if you slow down any from when you've arrived, you now trip the downshift. Now you're back down here, and that's when they're talking about the gear shifting. And it all comes down to the values that are selected for pedal position, what engine speed to upshift at, and then when to downshift when you've got zero pedal input. So this part of the video is going to be a recap of my experience with the DSG Tune. It's just real kind of high level of what I've gone through. So bought a used car, had the TCU Tune already on it. After a while, drove another GTI with a different TCU Tune and realized that they drove differently. Wow, what do you know? And that got me into looking into how do they vary and what are the differences. And of course that's going online, and started to look online, try and find out some information. And it was very subjective, which isn't particularly helpful because a lot of these are very similar, and the differences are pretty subtle, and it's matters a lot how you shift and what you want the car to shift like. So that led me to trying to be a little more objective, recording how the car shifted so that I could compare and evaluate different software in a less subjective manner. That is a bit expensive to buy multiple versions of the same software from different vendors. Fortunately, the Cobb Access port makes that a little bit easier because it's not so expensive, but still, you're spending some money just doing trial and error, finding something that you like. One of the companies I reached out to was 034, and I mentioned the opportunity to do a refund. They said, well, if you're not happy with it, we'll see if we can't make some changes to it to make it more to your liking. I thought that sounds really good. And so I did take them up on that, and probably had about a half a dozen revisions. It was around the 5th revision when there was a regression which it's trial and error to some extent to making something that I like. One of the things that I learned was I didn't really appreciate beforehand what all can be changed and how subtle and what differences that leads to. So there was a lot more to be done than I had an appreciation for as I went, when I had first approached them. There was a lot more to it than what I knew then. And as I started working on it, there was more that I wanted to do. And there were things that I realized I wasn't happy with, and it just kept going. So we had just gotten started and when we had one of the regressions where we made a change and the previous version was probably better, and 034 was getting really busy. Their engineer was having difficulty getting back to me in time, and eventually that just was more than what they could do. And looking back and knowing what I've done since, I completely understand that. I had contacted 5150, who offer a custom tune, very inexpensive custom tune. So inexpensive that it was no surprise to me when I laid out what I had in mind, and they said, that's not something we're going to be able to do for what we're charging. So that didn't work out. I moved on from 5150, and I went back and I talked to Stratified, Tuning about, I had their tune and I had some suggestions for how they might be able to refine it a little bit, and or at least in my mind refine it a little bit, at least the drive mode. And they were open to hearing the suggestions, and so I worked with them for I forget how long it was. It was a while. We ended up doing 16 revisions, and then they released their updates with my inputs on it, and it was a really good learning experience to evaluate the data and see recommended changes and what those results were. But it just showed me how much more there was to this that I hadn't looked at previously. And then HP Tuners came out with their self-tuning, do-it-yourself option that included DSG tunes and modifying the DSG tables. And I jumped on that. And that's what I've been doing for probably about a year and a half now, is just going into the tables that I'm showing here and modifying the values. And as I said, tens of thousands of different ways you can do this. So that could be a very time-consuming process. So now I'm using HP tuners, and as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of different settings, or at least different values that you can use in these tables. And there's no need to go through every single one, but you really need to evaluate the data that you've got, analyze it, and then come up with some ways to correlate what's going on with the data with what the driver is experiencing, and use that feedback to then make changes into the tune. And so by being the test driver as well as the test engineer, making the software changes and basically revising the software myself, or at least the values in the software, there's a really tight feedback loop to the developer from the user. And I've been able to make a lot of refinements to it, at least get an appreciation for what is possible. Of course, this tuning is in line with what I have as far as objectives, but I've also been able to experiment, try different things, see how I can make it smoother and very dynamic is what I'm shooting for. A very dynamic drive mode, but that is also smooth. So it goes from being extremely sporty to very mild, just based on driver's input. So that's kind of what I've been doing, and why I feel like I can talk a little bit to some of these tables. So hopefully that helps you out a little bit in your selection of a DSG tune, if that's something you're looking for. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and post them up and see if I can answer them.